Welcome back, Michelle. It's great to see you.
Hey Dan, how's it going?
It's good. I'm glad we're recording another episode. I know we kind of fell off the bandwagon a little bit, but we are back.
Yeah,
And
life gets in the way and you just roll with it.
you sure do. And I think that's what we're reminding ourselves too. We kind of do as much as we can to get ready, but then reality happens and we just kind of keep adjusting. So
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'm excited about today's episode because, Michelle, kind of imagine this. Like you wake up in the morning feeling pretty good. You think I actually slept well last night. And then you reach over, you look at your phone, and your sleep tracker gives you a score of like 62 or something. And suddenly you're thinking, wait a minute, wait a minute. Did I actually sleep badly? Like, why didn't I get enough deep sleep? Like, what happened to my REM? I feel like it's always what happened to my REM. And so here's the question we're tackling today is, does your wearable actually know how you slept, or is it making an educated guess?
And that's a really important distinction because, whether it's the Oura Ring or your Apple Watch, Fitbit, Garmin, or the knockoff versions on Amazon, what I will tell you is it's really not measuring your brain waves. It's measuring some peripheral biometric device. And it's not that it's nothing, it's just that it's not talking about your brain waves. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the holy grail, but it's not useless information. It's still biometric.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is the question that suddenly got a lot more attention out there because, Aura is now kind of facing a proposed kind of class action lawsuit, challenging some of its sleep tracking accuracy claims. And we're going to kind of explain that lawsuit a little bit and what it actually kind of alleges, and really what Aura says in response to, and more importantly, what the science kind of really tells us about what the devices can and cannot do. And so stay with us because towards the end, we're going to give you kind of one simple rule for using sleep trackers without letting your sleep score start controlling your sleep.
All right, Dan, let me first explain to you and to the other people that haven't listened to early versions of it about what we're actually trying to measure clinically during sleep. So, the gold standard that was discovered in about the 50s for diagnostic polysomnography, or a PSG, is where you have from head to toe, you're hooked up with wires. The ones on the head are called electroencephalogram leads, so EEG leads. They're the same leads that we use when we're looking for seizures or brain lesions, or when someone's having like a brain surgery where they put the leads on the scalp so they know which parts of the brain are active. And we're looking at electrical activity. So the ones on the head are the electrical activity from the brain. They put some leads on the outside of the eyes that are looking for the electrical activity of the dipoles of the eyes, because we have a positive and negative factor in our actual eyes. And then we're looking at muscle tone on the chin, airflow out of your nose or your mouth. We're looking on your finger with the pulse oximeter, your heart rate, and your oxygen. And then there's usually a belt on your chest and a belt on your abdomen to look at your breathing parameters. And then typically we put leads on the legs. And if sometimes we put leads maybe on the outside of your muscles to look for like teeth grinding in your jaw, or sometimes we'll put it on your hands if we're looking for dream enactment activity. But those signals allow sleep specialists and sleep technologists, physicians, to classify it into wake and sleep and what kind of sleep it is, whether it's light sleep or deep sleep or REM sleep, which some people call deep and some people call light. But REM sleep, you have muscle paralysis. And so in your brain waves, you're actually going much more activity, even like when you're awake versus any of the other sleep patterns, but your muscles and your whole rest of your body are paralyzed.
Right. And so clearly your ring is not obviously doing all of that. Like it's not stuck to your head when you're falling asleep at night. It's literally just hanging out on your finger.
Correct. Yeah. So the biometrics that they can figure out in your finger, it's a smaller device. It's a lot easier to measure. I forgot to mention, even during diagnostic polysomnogram, we always videotape people. But these wearables that are they're much smaller and they're working on movement tracking. And then because they have an infrared light in there, they can still measure the wavelength of the light going through, your nail bed or your skin. But there is some variability and some wiggle room. So I tell people traditionally it's about plus and minus 3 percentage points. So if your oxygen level is 90%, it could be as high as 93%. It could be as low as 87%. And so you have to look for some of those trends. And if your normal for like a heart rate is between 60 and 100 regularly, while you're sleeping, in general, you want your heart rate to be lower than when you're awake. So if your resting heart rate while you're awake is 60, but while you're sleeping, it goes somewhere between like 60 and 100, that would be pretty abnormal versus if it's normally 60 or some 70 while you're awake, a pretty typical would be 40s while you're sleeping, and 40 generally would not be considered kind of a normal wake up type of heart rate. Oxygen level, no matter who you are, should never be under 90%. But some people that are, whether it's on CPAP or they're actually wearing oxygen, maybe we're measuring something that's outside of ourselves. So when we look at physiologically, if the person's asleep, we want to pay attention to the pattern of what's normally supposed to happen during sleep. And it's not that you're just laying there and you're, you know, like inconsequentially not moving. There's important physiologic processes happening. And it's an inference of like a sneak peek window into what's happening. And it's not a dirty word. I mean, medicine and science use all these like nuances and inferences all the time, but it's different than actually directly measuring the signals that we do during a clinical sleep study. So the Oura Ring itself says it estimates the sleep stages because we're using these different physiologic parameters. And the ring is not exactly a substitute for that.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the interesting, really, important pieces to this and why we're kind of having a conversation. There's really kind of hierarchy here. At the bottom of the things, you have this device that's kind of physically sensing something. Your finger moved, your heartbeat, your skin temperature changed. Then we move one level up. And the algorithm here takes these measurements and it makes an estimate. That estimate might be something like, we think you were asleep, or we think this portion of the night was REM, or we think this portion of the night was deep sleep. And then we go one more level up and get something like, okay, your sleep score was calculated at a 79. But there isn't a sleep laboratory somewhere where, Michelle, where you could hook someone up to equipment and discover that your biological sleep score from last night was officially a 79.
Yeah, no, there's definitely not like this sleep score that you have an electrode for or a parameter. It's a composite with different things. And you need to understand that because just like with your SAT, if you can't read, but you're great at math, it, I mean, you're going to get some points for putting your name on it, but it doesn't mean that you're a well-rounded, intelligent person.
Exactly, and this is so important, especially for, those of our listeners who really love their wearables, which we love wearables too, by the way. We are a fan of they give a lot of good data points, but that score, that number, that specific number, it's really just a proprietary interpretation of several pieces of information, and that doesn't automatically make it bad, but it does mean that we need to understand what kind of number we're really looking at. And I think that's really an essential distinction. Wearables can provide measurements, calculations, estimates, interpretations, but those aren't necessarily the same thing. And so this kind of brings us to that lawsuit. But before we talk about that, the lawsuit that was filed against the Oura Ring maker, we want to talk about an important disclaimer here. This case isn't completely, it's new, and we're not attorneys, and we're just discussing this publicly based on what information is available. And we're talking about it from a sleep science perspective. We're not weighing in on any of the legalities of these things.
Yeah, and all the allegations made in this lawsuit, they're not established facts.
Yep, exactly. And so what this case is, this is the case between Suber versus Aura, and it was filed in August in federal court in California, and the August of 26. And the proposed class action kind of challenges Aura's marketing around surrounding the accuracy of its sleep stage tracking. And so, among other things, the complaint kind of argues that because the ring isn't measuring brain waves, eye movements, and muscle activity the way that polysomnography does, that its sleep stages are being inferred from peripheral physiological signals rather than directly measured from the traditional clinical standard. And the complaint kind of characterizes those estimates much more critically and kind of challenges some of Aura's, advertised kind of accuracy claims.
Yeah, I mean, it's equally important to understand the people that make the Oura Rings position. And they're disputing these allegations because it actually says that sleep stages are associated with measurable changes in the body temperature and these biometric measurements with the heart rate, heart rate variability, movement, respirations, temperature. They are not the only company that does this. That's important. And their argument is that these algorithms can be helpful to detect physiologic patterns, to estimate the stages, and they can be interpreted with some meaningful accuracy and give these points. They also, they study in peer-reviewed research, most of it which they supported financially. They compare it to polysomnography, and there are many people that go through sleep testing with their devices on in a sleep lab. And there is a degree of concordance and accuracy that goes along with it.
Mhm. In fact, I remember, Michelle, we talked about this a couple episodes back, but of all of them, Aura had one of the higher accuracies in terms of their sleep measurements kind of corresponding to that. But regardless, what we want to kind of get at is we're not here to predict what happens legally. The more interesting question for us and really for our listeners is, how useful are these estimates that your Oura Ring, your Apple Watch, your Whoop Band, your any of these things, how useful are these estimates in the real world?
Yeah, and the answer is it accurate or is it inaccurate? One of the biggest misconceptions about wearable research is that the accuracy depends on what you're actually asking the device to identify. So, for example, one of the 2024 studies from researcher Brigham and Women's and Harvard Medical School, they compared Oura Ring Generation 3, Apple Watch Series 8, and the Fitbit Send 2. Um, Kind of similar types of devices directly with the diagnostic polysomnograms in a small number of healthy adults. I think there were 35 people in the studies. All three of the devices actually did fairly well at identifying the sleep duration. Sleep duration being how fast it takes somebody to fall asleep to when they woke up and finished the test. So again, the start of a sleep study is lights out to lights on, and then we're estimating the sleep time in there. That's the sleep duration. And when researchers looked specifically at the sleep staging, the performance was variable between the 3, 4 devices. And for the Oura Ring, the sleep stage sensitivity was roughly, I don't know, about 76-80%, which is pretty good, depending on which stage of sleep. So we know that the REM stages of sleep are probably easier to identify than separating out the stages 1, 2, and 3. I always tell the students and the technologists, I mean, the default of our sleep is stage 2, which is still considered the light sleep. So they're going to overestimate some of that lighter sleep versus the deep sleep. And it's not random information. It did correlate with it, but it's also not the same thing as saying every minute of the REM displayed on your actual phone represents exactly what your brain is doing through the night.
Yeah, absolutely. And another kind of validation study that involved around 96 people found generally good agreement between the Oura Ring Gen 3 and the polysomnography on several overall sleep measures, while sleep stage performance kind of varied depending on which stage was being examined. And what's interesting is that particular study also disclosed financial support from Aura for some of its authors, which again is something readers should always be aware of when interpreting research, and something we try to highlight whenever we're recommending products or reviewing these things. Because although a disclosed industry relationship by itself doesn't determine whether the research findings are valid or invalid, it's always important to know who supported it, who funded it, those types of things.
Yeah, and that's why I tell people, your wearable has no idea how you're sleeping is generally a false statement, but it doesn't know everything about your sleep. I wouldn't interpret consumer wearable data the same way I'd interpret a clinical sleep study, and that's not just because this is my job and this is what I do, but the different tools that are designed for different purposes. If we're meant to biohack or improve our lives versus if we're meant to diagnose some pathologic condition that we need to initiate treatment for.
Mhm. This is where it becomes especially interesting from an insomnia perspective because, sometimes the accuracy of the device isn't even the biggest clinical issue. The bigger question actually becomes what happens psychologically after somebody sees the number. Dun dun dun. I feel like we should add special effects to that because, there's actually a term in the sleep literature around this called orthosomnia, and researchers kind of started describing people becoming so focused on optimizing the numbers generated by their sleep trackers that the pursuit of, quote, perfect sleep can actually increase worry and sleep related effort. In fact, Michelle, you and I did an episode on this whole sleep maxing
Right.
and, trends on social media where people are like, oh my gosh, I have this thing's give me a number. Well, that just means if I can get this number better, I must be doing it better.
Yeah.
And so, what's important about that is that doesn't mean that wearables cause insomnia. And plenty of people can use wearables without any problem whatsoever. But for some people, particularly people who already are prone to worrying about their sleep, the tracker can become another nightly performance evaluation. Maybe you wake up feeling fine, and then the app tells you poor recovery. And now you're checking, to see how much deep sleep you actually had. You're wondering why your REM was low, as if you know what to do to make your REM. And, so then you're Googling how to increase your sleep score. And maybe tonight you go to bed an hour earlier because you're determined to get an 85 instead of a 72. And now you're trying harder to sleep. And unfortunately, we know that trying harder is all about behavioral conditioning, which we're going to get to in a moment. And, unfortunately, sleep is one of those biological processes that often become harder when we start trying too hard to control it.
So this is what I really want you to kind of pay attention to at this point. I want you to think about wearables as identifying useful patterns. And night to night, there's going to be some variability, but you want to look for different patterns. Is your typical sleep schedule shifting dramatically? And is that dependent on you as a person or just different things that are going on around you? If you're consistently getting less hours of sleep, so maybe it's a new hobby or a habit that you picked up and now you are getting less sleep. I know over the period of where I was taking my daughter to school, I was doing just a lot of reading to try and clear my head, but they ended up being really good books and I was staying up later than usual. If there's physiologic trends that change substantially, I looked at with a person today, their heart rate. And in general, you want your heart rate to be low. If it's popping up in the middle of the night and it hadn't been, these are things that I want you to pay attention to. The patterns can be really useful information more than the individual days. And I'd be cautious about drawing major conclusions from things like my ring says I only got 41 minutes of deep sleep last night, so something must be medically wrong with me. You really want to look at patterns over a period of time and then involve your healthcare provider or kind of take a step back on what else could be going on. And that's a much better way to take some of this individual data.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the takeaways here is think of your wearable as giving you trend data, but not necessarily a verdict. And I would even add another layer to this, like your daytime functioning really matters. Like how sleepy are you? How are you functioning? How do you feel? Can you engage with your work, your family, your exercise, your relationships, and the rest of your life? We don't want someone feeling perfectly fine until an app convinces them that they've had a terrible night of sleep based on a score.
Yeah, the opposite also works is if you're experiencing significant daytime sleepiness and loud snoring, pauses in your breathing, but your sleep score looks good. I mean, this is something that you have to kind of pay attention to because maybe we're missing the point. A consumer device sleep score isn't a medical evaluation, so you have to take some of these things with a grain of salt.
Yep. And so here's the simple one rule, thing that we promised, at the beginning here. Use your sleep tracker as information, not instruction. And what I mean by this is if the information helps you to notice healthy patterns without making you anxious, wonderful. It sounds like that is a workable use of a wearable for you. If your wearable helps you realize, wow, when I consistently give myself enough opportunity to sleep, I feel better, that's potentially useful. Like that's good information to know. However, if you're waking up every morning and the first thing you need to know is whether your device says that you slept well, this is where I want you to start trying an experiment, for a week or two, maybe these next week or, week or two in front of you. I want you to not look at your sleep score first. Before opening the app, I want you to ask yourself, how do I actually feel this morning? And then go start living your day. And you may actually discover that the relationship between your score and your actual functioning is much weaker than you assumed.
Yeah, your body doesn't wake up in the morning and ask the server what your sleep score was before deciding whether it's feeling rested. Make sure that you pay attention to how you feel and maybe only look at your device or your app a few times a week.
Exactly, 100%.
So the takeaway is that wearables aren't worthless. Okay. I don't want you to say, oh, I should just like throw my Apple Watch in the trash. They measure real physiologic signals, and the research suggests that some of the sleep estimates can provide really meaningful information that can be actionable for you on a regular basis. But they're not diagnostic testing, and sleep stage estimates should be understood as estimates or generalizations.
Yes, and from the psychological side, more data isn't automatically better. If tracking your sleep helps you to understand your sleep, that's great. But if tracking makes you monitor, worry, compare, optimize, and chase perfect sleep, then it might be worth changing your relationship with your sleep tracker. And this is whether it's a ring or a watch or a strap or whatever, or if maybe it's built into your bed or your 8 sleep system, doesn't matter what. Like, well, you might need to reevaluate that relationship when that shows up. So when tomorrow morning comes and your phone says that you scored a 68, before deciding you slept badly, I want you to ask yourself one question. How was my sleep before I looked at the score? That answer may tell you more than you think.
So that's our episode for Sleep Takeout today. Next time, we're going to find out if Dan actually purchased a wearable.
Oh, yes. I'm excited to see you guys next time too. And we're curious, for those of us who are listening to the podcast or watching us on YouTube, do you use an Oura Ring or an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin or another sleep tracker that might be built into your mattress or base? Tell us in the comments, does your sleep data help you to sleep better? Or does it sometimes make you worry about your sleep? And also stay tuned for a future episode where we're going to talk more about this behavioral conditioning that is so important if you are having insomnia, which again is difficulty going back to sleep in the middle of the night or difficulty falling asleep in the beginning of the night. We're going to dive into that a lot more next time. All right. Well, until next time, Sleep Nation. Bye bye.
Bye.